There exists a modern phenomenon that draws the attention of both our cultural curiosity and our psychological inquiry: the woman who lives alone without a man. To the unconscious collective, she might appear as a mystery, an anomaly, or even a threat. But if we dare to look deeper, beyond social norms and inherited traditions, we find not a lack, but a profound inner process unfolding. The woman who lives alone is not necessarily lonely. Loneliness is not a matter of geography, but of psyche, and many who dwell within companionship are far lonelier than those who sit with their own soul in silence. This woman is not barren, nor is she incomplete. She is in fact engaged in one of the deepest acts of individuation, facing herself without distraction, without projection, without the comforting illusions of external validation. She has withdrawn from the conventional narrative that a woman must be completed by a man. This is not a rejection of relationship, but an invitation to authenticity. For in our dreams, we see often the anima and animus, those inner images of the feminine and masculine, appearing not as adversaries, but as guides towards psychic wholeness. The woman alone is not without the masculine. She is in dialogue with it within her own soul, and perhaps because of this, she is less likely to be dominated by it unconsciously. Our culture has long defined women by their relational roles: daughter, wife, mother. But in solitude, a woman meets herself beyond roles. She discovers what she loves, not because someone else desires it, but because it resonates with her essential being. She touches the eternal feminine not as a stereotype, but as an archetype, a force that seeks meaning, depth, and wholeness beyond the visible. There are moments in a human life when the noise of the world recedes, not because one has fled from it, but because the soul demands silence. Solitude, when embraced consciously, is not isolation, but initiation. It is the crucible of transformation. For the woman who lives alone without a man, this solitude is not a punishment nor an escape, but a profound psychic container in which the process of individuation begins to unfold. She steps away from the expectations of roles that society has placed upon her, not out of rebellion, but out of necessity. The mask of the persona begins to crack, not because she wishes to be seen differently, but because she wishes to see herself clearly. Individuation is not comfort. It is not a path of ease or admiration. It is a confrontation with the unknown within. In solitude, she meets her many selves: the frightened child, the striving achiever, the lover, the abandoned, the fierce, the broken, the healer. These are not merely moods, but archetypal figures of her inner world, asking not to be exiled, but to be integrated. There, alone, she hears what could not be heard in the noise of companionship, the voice of the self, subtle, insistent, whole. The self is not the ego. It is not the woman she thinks she is, but the woman she is becoming, always becoming. The world often misunderstands solitude, especially in women. It sees lack where there is a quiet richness. It sees sadness where there is sacred withdrawal. But the woman who walks this path knows the value of this inner descent. Like Inanna into the underworld, she descends not to die, but to shed all that is false. Each silence she bears, each lonely evening, is a ritual of uncovering, peeling back the layers placed upon her by others, by culture, by time. What remains is something deeper, more ancient, the self, eternal, unique, waiting to be remembered. There is no mirror in solitude except the one within. She can no longer rely on the reflection of another to tell her who she is. And in this lies both terror and liberation. She is no longer the projection of another man's anima, no longer the fantasy, the role, the support system for someone else's narrative. She becomes the subject of her own story, and this shift is tectonic. It moves the foundations of her psyche, allowing her to ground herself not in the approval of others, but in the truth she uncovers within. The path of individuation cannot be walked in a crowd. It is narrow, sacred, and deeply personal. It requires solitude because it demands the dissolution of false selves and the emergence of the authentic center. The woman who lives alone is not turning her back on life. She is turning toward her soul. She is not without connection. She is rediscovering connection from within. In solitude, she becomes not a fragment, but a totality. She is no longer an echo of the outer world, but a voice arising from the depths of her own being. There are forces within each of us that defy the physical boundaries of gender, echoing deeper patterns rooted in the collective unconscious. The woman who lives without a man is not merely alone in the outer world. She is undertaking an inward journey toward psychological wholeness, a union not with another, but with what Carl Jung named the Animus, the inner masculine figure that dwells in the psyche of every woman. Just as every man carries within him the image of the Anima, the feminine soul image, so too does every woman harbor the presence of the masculine counterpart. These are not fantasies or mere reflections of lived experiences, but archetypal realities that guide the development of the self. The Anima and Animus are bridges to the unconscious, messengers from the deeper strata of the soul. To ignore them is to remain fractured, to remain at the mercy of unconscious projection, casting the inner masculine outward onto men in the outer world and expecting them to complete what has been left unrecognized within. But the woman who chooses solitude often does so unknowingly at first, moved by an instinct she cannot yet name. It is not simply a withdrawal from others, but a calling toward interior integration. When no longer caught in the projections of the outer masculine, she begins to feel the stirrings of the animus inside her, not as judgment or demand, but as a guide. At first, this inner masculine may appear as critical, rigid, even oppressive. These are the early forms, the animus as opinion, as authority, as dogma, echoing centuries of patriarchal conditioning that have shaped not only the outer world, but also the inner psychic reality. But as she continues the work of inner reflection, of dream analysis, of honest confrontation with her desires and wounds, the animus begins to evolve. He becomes no longer a tyrant, but a protector of vision, no longer an accuser, but a bringer of clarity. He leads her not to submission, but to sovereignty. He lends her the sword of discernment and the courage to articulate her truth. In dreams, he may come as a wise stranger, a voice of reason, a dark man with deep eyes offering a book, a map, a key. These are not idle symbols, but signs of the integration taking place. The woman no longer looks outside herself for authority. She no longer needs to be seen to feel real. The animus, once an unconscious force pulling her toward destructive or hollow unions, becomes a conscious ally in her individuation. Through him, she finds direction, focus, spiritual grounding. Through him, she learns to stand alone, not as a rejection of love, but as the precondition for it. This inner union is not a fixed state, but an alchemical process, always shifting, always deepening. It is the reconciliation of opposites, the merging of the inner feminine's receptivity with the inner masculine's initiative. From this union arises not dependency, but creative vitality. She no longer lives in fragments, she becomes whole. To live alone, without the distraction of constant relationship, is to enter a quiet chamber where the walls begin to echo with forgotten voices. When the woman steps into solitude, not as an escape, but as a necessary descent, she crosses a threshold into the realm of her own unconscious. There, beneath the polished surface of identity, she meets the one figure most often avoided, the shadow. It is not the outer world that first terrifies her, but the hidden world within. The shadow is not evil by nature, it is merely what has been rejected, unloved, unacknowledged. It is all that she could not bear to be, all that society told her she must not become. And now, without the noise of companionship, without the endless performance of acceptability, the shadow comes knocking. The woman who lives without a man enters a space that offers no convenient projection, no easy distraction. She can no longer cast her fear onto him, her longing, her anger, her dependence. The mirror is gone, and in its place is the darkened surface of her own soul. The shadow does not come gently. It appears as anxiety, as rage, as shame, as the unbearable memory or the haunting feeling of inadequacy. It wears the faces of those she resents and the faces of those she has wronged. It is the lost child, the envious sister, the bitter mother, the sexual rival, the self she buried to be loved. It is the pain of abandonment and the guilt of independence. And in this confrontation she must choose, flee into distraction once more or stay and witness. To confront the shadow is to step into the underworld of the psyche. It is to allow the unwanted to speak. It is not a heroic conquest, but a sacred reckoning. The woman learns that to become whole, she must be willing to integrate what she fears. She begins to see that what she rejected held the very vitality she needs. The aggression she disowned becomes courage. The sadness she avoided becomes compassion. The sexuality she repressed becomes creative fire. The dependency she despised becomes tenderness. Every piece of the shadow contains life, but life twisted by rejection. It is not enough to analyze it. She must feel it, suffer it, love it back into being. The culture does not reward a woman who embraces her shadow. It rewards the obedient, the sweet, the pleasing image. But in solitude, she is no longer performing. She begins to unearth the power that lies in authenticity, and it is precisely this power that the shadow guards, the treasure hidden in the darkness. As she faces her own inner split, she ceases to be ruled by it. She no longer fears what arises from within, because she knows it now. She recognizes her darkness as part of her own nature, not a threat but a path. Through this confrontation, the woman does not become less, she becomes more. She becomes capable of holding the full complexity of her humanity without collapsing into it or denying it. There is a great psychic burden placed upon the individual who dares to step outside the collective pattern. The woman who lives alone without a man becomes, often unknowingly, a vessel of projection, both feared and admired, pitied and envied. She is no longer playing the accepted role in the social drama, and this makes her a magnet for unconscious contents, not only from others but from the collective unconscious itself. For centuries, the feminine has been defined not by what it is, but by how it relates to the masculine. A woman was wife, mother, daughter, lover, but rarely simply self. And so, when a woman no longer reflects the needs or desires of others, she becomes a mirror too dark and too clear. Into her solitude, society casts its unresolved anxieties, myths, and expectations. She becomes the witch, the spinster, the dangerous woman who knows herself. But what is actually happening beneath these projections is a deeply sacred psychological process, the rejection of collective projections. The woman no longer consents to carry the roles assigned to her by culture. She no longer smiles to be pleasing. She no longer shapes her body to be consumed. She no longer tones down her intellect, her mystery, her truth in order to be acceptable. In doing so, she breaks the ancient pact with the collective persona, the mask society wears to keep the illusion of order, and the collective resents her for it because she reminds others of the freedom they have not claimed. To reject the projections of the collective is not merely an act of defiance, it is an act of individuation. For the projections that society places upon the woman are the same projections it places upon the unconscious, the unknown, the irrational, the dangerous. By stepping outside of these definitions, she begins to embody what Jung called the self, not the ego, but the totality of the psyche. She no longer allows herself to be seen merely as a function for another's purpose. She becomes a center unto herself, but this comes with a cost. To no longer be projected upon is to become invisible to many, misunderstood by most. Yet in that invisibility lies an inner freedom, the ability to become what she truly is, rather than what she is supposed to be. Projections are unconscious. They are the soul's way of avoiding its own work. The man who sees her as cold may be repressing his own vulnerability. The woman who sees her as selfish may fear her own unlived independence. But the woman who has begun to confront these projections within herself sees them not as enemies, but as invitations to wakefulness. She no longer absorbs them, she reflects them. Her aloneness becomes a kind of mirror that returns the unconscious material to the sender. This is not cruelty, it is psychological maturity. She refuses to live as a symbol of someone else's fear or fantasy. In doing so, she steps out of the myth and into reality, a reality rooted not in conformity, but in inner truth. There is a dangerous illusion that permeates the modern psyche, inherited from both fairy tales and cultural conditioning, the belief that relationship completes us. It is a notion that casts the individual as half a being, wandering the world in search of a missing part. But the deeper psychology reveals a far more demanding truth. No relationship, no matter how profound, can make whole what has not been first united within. The woman who lives alone without a man is not always choosing against relationship, but rather for something more primary, the inner work of integration. She is not seeking to be completed, but to become complete. Wholeness is not perfection, but a unification of opposites. It is the bringing together of light and shadow, masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious. It is a process, not a destination. The woman who undergoes this inward journey begins to discover that to offer love to another without first having met the depths of her own being is to offer a fragment, not a self. She sees that dependency is often mistaken for intimacy, and that the need to be saved is frequently disguised as love. But love that is born of need, of fear, of incompletion, becomes a prison, one built not of malice, but of unconsciousness. In her solitude, she meets the many aspects of herself she once would have buried in relationship. The voices that were too loud, the truths that were too painful, the desires too unruly. She learns to sit with her own chaos, to endure her own silence, and to nourish herself from within. This is not a rejection of connection, but a preparation for it. She is creating within her psyche the capacity to relate without fusion, to love without possession, to bond without betrayal of the self. For Jung, relationship was never about merging into one, but about the confrontation of two whole selves standing face to face, mirrors of one another's unconscious material. But such confrontation is only possible when each individual has first met their own soul. The woman who has done this work becomes dangerous not in a destructive sense, but because she can no longer be manipulated by the illusions of romantic fantasy. She cannot be seduced by promises of completion because she already knows her wholeness. She may still choose relationship, but from an entirely different ground. It is no longer a rescue mission, but a sacred meeting. She does not enter into love out of emptiness, but out of fullness. She does not cling because she is rooted. She does not lose herself because she has already found herself. And this is the paradox. Only when she no longer needs the other can she truly see them. Only when she has become whole can she enter into a relationship that does not consume her, but expands her. The journey of the woman who lives alone without a man is not a deviation from nature, but a return to it, a reclamation of the soul's forgotten path. Her solitude is not a condition to be pitied, but a psychic container in which the alchemical fire of transformation is lit. In turning inward, she does not escape life. She encounters it in its most essential form. She confronts her shadow, integrates her animus, sheds the collective projections that distort her image, and labors toward a wholeness that no outer union could ever bestow. In her aloneness, she ceases to be a reflection of another and becomes a vessel of her own truth. This is not merely a personal evolution, it is a symbolic act that challenges the collective unconscious, revealing that the feminine is not a role, but a mystery, not a dependency, but a power, not a lack, but a fullness. Her life becomes a living individuation, a quiet revolution in the face of centuries that have spoken otherwise. For in knowing herself, she invites the world to know something deeper, that the soul, once awakened, seeks not completion from without, but unity from within.